The entire office building made fun of the quiet cleaning lady, but one day, the boss invited her to sit in for important negotiations. The secretary's hair turned gray when he realized what was happening. No one really paid attention to Nancy, the cleaning lady, at the construction firm's office. Dressed in her work uniform and yellow gloves, this woman selflessly fought dust on the windows, dirt on the floors, and trash in the trash cans. It was hard to say if Nancy liked her job, since she always worked in silence and preferred not to distract the staff with empty talk. The boss never had any complaints about the woman because she always did her job well, keeping the office space clean and shiny, like a new coin. Many of the employees often called her the wrong name, and some didn't even want to know her name at all. Nancy's days were full of monotonous, painstaking work, and were all similar, like 2 drops of water. One day, while cleaning the boss's office, Nancy accidentally became witness to a rather strange conversation. Sitting at the table, the boss and his secretary seemed to be having a very agitated conversation and were actively gesturing with their hands. "So what am I supposed to do now? How are we going to negotiate tomorrow?" Elliot Clark asked, his voice sounding desperate. It was under his leadership that the company had been flourishing for several years. The boss was angry because important negotiations with representatives of a Chinese company were planned for the next day, and his in-house translator got angina and had to be admitted to the hospital the day before. "I don't know, sir. Maybe we should bring in an outside interpreter? We could try contacting a translation agency, for example," Arthur Johnson answered. He was feeling guilty, as he held 2 positions at first, the secretary and the recruiter. "That's not an option. I saw how they work. Their translations are so bad that it's impossible to understand what the partners are talking about. If only it were a simpler language. French or Spanish, for example. But Chinese? There are few experts who really know this language," Mr. Clark said doubtfully. At that moment, Nancy, who involuntarily heard the entire conversation from beginning to end, looked at her superiors with a silent question. "What is it, Nancy? Are you done cleaning?" asked the secretary irritably. The young cleaning lady was a little embarrassed, and then, tucking away her bangs that had stuck out from under her work cap, she said, "Yes, I'm done, Mr. Johnson, but that's not what I wanted to say. The thing is, if you need an interpreter, I can help you." "And what can you do, may I ask? Will you talk to our Chinese partners using gestures?" the boss asked with irony in his voice. Nancy got even more embarrassed, her face blushing. "No, sir, I know this language very well, and I can help you," she answered, plucking up her courage. The boss and his secretary looked at each other in disbelief, still unaware about what was happening. And then Elliot Clark opened the safe and took out a copy of the contract written in Chinese. He handed it to the young cleaning lady, saying, "Here, read it out loud, and then translate what you read." To the great surprise of both men, Nancy picked up the piece of paper full of Chinese characters without a shadow of a doubt and began to read confidently. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she translated everything she had read and even pointed out 2 spelling errors in the text. Needless to say, the whole situation impressed the boss and his secretary. They were truly amazed. "Nancy, how do you know this language so well? And why are you working as a cleaner?" Elliot Clark asked. The girl simply smiled shyly and shrugged in response. Of course, the head of the company understood that he was taking a serious risk, hiring an office cleaner for negotiations. However, he didn't really have a better option, so he decided to risk it. "Well, Nancy, I'll give you a chance to prove yourself and interpret for us during tomorrow's negotiations. Now, finish up with your work, and Mr. Johnson will take you shopping for some new clothes. You can't come to negotiations in your cleaning uniform," Mr. Clark said, smiling. Nancy nodded in agreement and left the office to go change. Half an hour later, Nancy and the secretary were already standing in the clothing store, in the middle of the shopping center. The sales assistant appreciated Nancy's slim body and quickly picked out an office outfit she needed. In response to her glance at Mr. Johnson, Nancy saw him smiling and holding his thumb up in approval. "Our cleaning ladies are really beautiful," the man thought, taking Nancy home. As it turned out, the young lady lived in a rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. In parting, Arthur Johnson reminded the newly minted translator what time she needed to be at the office tomorrow, and then disappeared into the night in his expensive car. The next day, Nancy woke up earlier than usual and immediately set to work on her appearance. After spending at least an hour in front of the mirror, she finally put on her business attire and went to the office. During the negotiations, Mr. Clark and his secretary were extremely anxious about the outcome of the meeting. However, despite all their fears, Nancy did great, and the delegation from China was very much pleased with the translator, who showed such deep knowledge of their native language. Congratulations, Nancy. Honestly, I didn't expect you to do this good. You should quit your cleaning job and think about a career at our company, the boss said, pleased with the successful outcome of the negotiations. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful, Mr. Clark. That'd be great, Nancy replied modestly. Well, what are you waiting for then? Let me see your documents and your diploma, and I'll get you hired as the full-time translator, the secretary intervened in the conversation. In response to this, Nancy threw her hands up and explained that she didn't have any documents on her at the time. Okay, can you bring them in later? I don't think it's that important, especially after what you did for us today. The boss hastened to ease up the situation. Nancy breathed a sigh of relief and, having gotten the management's permission, left the office. Meanwhile, the boss asked his secretary to vet the mysterious girl who was working as a cleaning lady but knew perfect Chinese. Arthur Johnson readily agreed to conduct the background check. Part of the secretary's zeal was due to his desire to please the boss, while the other part was due to the fact that he actually took a liking to Nancy, especially after her wonderful transformation from the quiet cleaning lady to the Chinese-speaking office beauty. It took Arthur about a week to find all the necessary information, and when he came to the chief's office with the folder in his hands, he had a satisfied smile on his face. Here, Mr. Clark, I found all there is, but maybe you should ask Nancy to come in first, so she could tell you everything herself, suggested the secretary. The boss agreed, and soon the young lady was already standing in front of him, unsure about how to start her story. Finally, plucking up her courage, she started speaking. As it turned out, the former cleaning lady was actually Nancy White. The woman's father was a wealthy businessman who lost his wife to a difficult childbirth when he was 43 years old. Fortunately, the doctors managed to save the newborn girl. The couple couldn't get pregnant for a long time, and when it finally happened, Amanda White's health had already been undermined by all kinds of hormonal treatments. Brandon White took his wife's death extremely hard. It took him about 6 months to fight his depression. Fortunately, the man did find the strength to continue living and to take care of his newborn daughter. Thus, despite not having a mother, Nancy was surrounded with love and care from an early age. The girl also had an amazing nanny, Mrs. Reynolds, who loved the baby very much. Everything went well, exactly until the millionaire widow brought a new woman into the house. By a strange coincidence, she looked exactly like the millionaire's late wife, and she even had the same name, Amanda. As soon as the stepmother moved into the family, the situation in the house immediately changed for the worse. Apparently, Amanda disliked Nancy from the first minutes of their acquaintance and seemed to have made Nancy her #1 enemy. Mrs. Reynolds immediately saw through the cunning gold digger who decided to instill her own order in the house, but she couldn't do anything about it. Mr. White loved his new wife and didn't allow anyone to speak ill of her. As it turned out a little later, the woman had very far-sighted plans for the millionaire widow. She was planning on getting her hands on Mr. White's fortune. To make sure Nancy didn't get in her way, as soon as the girl got a bit older, Amanda suggested that Mr. White should send her off to a boarding school in England. Thus, Amanda was planning to get rid of the hated stepdaughter and her nanny in one fell swoop. Brandon White liked his wife's idea, and without thinking long about it, he bought Nancy a ticket to London. Time passed. Even though she was far from home and missing her beloved nanny, Nancy did receive a good education and learned several languages. Unfortunately, by that time, her father's health wasn't great. He was having serious problems with his heart. During Nancy's studies abroad, Brandon White became a frequent visitor at the cardiology department of a private clinic. However, despite all the doctor's efforts, Brandon's last heart attack left the man no chance at survival. Amanda was so sly that she wasn't even going to tell Nancy about her father's death, and it was only thanks to her nanny's call that she learned what had happened to her father. When the grieving daughter returned to her homeland, the father's body was already buried. Without even letting her stepdaughter come to her senses, the stepmother told the young lady that her father had bequeathed all the fortune to his wife. How was that possible? "Can I see a copy of the will?" Nancy asked timidly, but Amanda didn't want to hear anything. Having allowed the hated stepdaughter to spend one night at the house, she kicked her out the next morning. Meanwhile, all her documents mysteriously disappeared from Nancy's bag. Left without any means to support herself, Nancy decided to find a job and then figure out what to do next. So that's how Nancy became the cleaning lady at the construction firm's offices, where she proved herself as an excellent employee. Having heard the young woman's story, the secretary paused for a second and then said something that almost caused Nancy to faint. "Actually, Amanda lied to you, Miss White. Your father left his entire fortune to you, his daughter," said Arthur Johnson, not taking his eyes off the girl. The tense silence that hung in the office was interrupted by the boss's voice. "Mr. Johnson, I think you need to help Miss White get some justice." The secretary nodded and decided not to postpone such an important assignment. So the very next day, people in uniform came to Amanda's house. Guided by Arthur, they helped the woman move out of the house she had illegally seized. As it turned out, the cunning widow lived in it with her lover. Their affair had started when Brandon White was still alive. Now that everything has fallen back into place and justice has triumphed, Nancy invited her beloved nanny to move back into the house, and she gladly agreed, since she was also devastated over their forced separation. Helping the former cleaning lady, Arthur Johnson involuntarily got infatuated by her. And judging by Nancy's blushing cheeks, the feelings were mutual. There were many pleasant moments ahead for the young couple, which would fill their hearts with true joy.